The desert wind carried the scent of death across the barren landscape as Jake Morrison rode his weary horse through the twisted canyon paths of the Arizona Territory. The sun blazed overhead like a merciless eye, casting harsh shadows between the red rock formations that jutted from the earth like broken teeth. Jake pulled his hat lower over his weathered face, squinting against the glare as he searched for any sign of water or shelter. Jake had been riding alone for 3 days, following rumors of a lost silver mine somewhere in these God-forsaken Badlands. At 42, he had spent most of his life drifting from one frontier town to another, working odd jobs and chasing dreams that always seemed to slip through his fingers like desert sand. His dark hair was streaked with gray, and deep lines marked his sun-beaten face, telling the story of a man who had seen too much hardship and not enough kindness. The horse beneath him snorted and shook its head, ears pricked forward with sudden alertness. Jake felt the animal's muscles tense and knew something was wrong. He reined in the mare and listened carefully to the desert silence. In the distance, carried on the hot wind, came the sound of voices shouting and the crack of wood against wood. Jake urged his horse forward, following the sounds through a narrow passage between 2 towering mesas. As he rounded a bend, the scene that greeted him made his blood run cold. 7 young Apache women stood in a line beneath a makeshift gallows constructed from rough timber. Each had a noose around her neck, the ropes tied to a horizontal beam supported by 2 vertical posts. The women's hands were bound behind their backs, and their dark eyes showed a mixture of defiance and fear. A group of 12 white men surrounded the gallows, their faces hard with cruel determination. Most wore the rough clothing of ranch hands and drifters, but Jake noticed that 3 of them were dressed more expensively, like businessmen or politicians. The leader of the group was a tall man with silver hair and a neat beard, wearing a black suit that seemed out of place in the desert heat. "You Apache devils brought this on yourselves," the silver-haired man was saying to the women. "Your people have been raiding our supply wagons and stealing our cattle. This is justice for what you've done." One of the Apache women, barely more than a girl with long black braids, lifted her chin proudly despite the noose around her throat. "We take nothing that was not ours first," she said in clear English. "You steal our land, kill our brothers, poison our water holes. We only take back what belongs to our people." The silver-haired man backhanded her across the face, sending her stumbling. "Lying savage. You'll hang for your crimes, and maybe your tribe will learn to respect civilized law." Jake's hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver at his hip. He had seen enough hangings in his time, most of them deserved, but something about this scene struck him as wrong. Apache raiders were typically men, not women, and these captives looked too young and too clean to be hardened warriors who had been living rough in the desert. He studied the men more carefully and noticed several things that troubled him. Their horses were too well fed and groomed for men who claimed to be chasing raiders across the Badlands. Some of them carried new rifles that would have cost a cowhand months of wages. Most telling of all, he spotted a distinctive brand on several of the horses, the Triple Crown mark used by the territorial government for official business. Jake made his decision quickly. He spurred his horse forward and rode directly into the clearing, his hand resting casually on his gun. "Morning, gentlemen," he called out in a friendly tone. "Mighty hot day for a necktie party, isn't it?" The silver-haired man turned toward him with obvious irritation. "This is none of your concern, stranger. Move along before you get yourself into trouble." Jake tipped his hat politely but made no move to leave. "Name's Jake Morrison. I've been tracking through these parts for days without seeing another soul. Couldn't help but wonder what brings so many fine gentlemen out to this lonely spot." He let his gaze drift meaningfully over their expensive gear and well-fed horses. "We're lawmen pursuing criminals," one of the ranch hands spoke up. "These Apache squaws have been raiding settlements and killing innocent folks." Jake nodded thoughtfully, then looked directly at the 7 women. That's peculiar. Most Apache war parties I've heard tell of don't include so many women. And these ladies look mighty well fed for folks who've been living off stolen cattle and raid supplies. He paused, letting his words sink in. Mind if I ask to see your badges and warrants? The silver-haired man's eyes narrowed dangerously. We don't need to show you anything, Drifter. You'd best ride on while you still can. But Jake had spotted something else that confirmed his suspicions. One of the Apache women was wearing a small silver cross on a chain around her neck. Christian jewelry that would be unusual for a hostile raider. Another had calloused hands but no weapon scars, suggesting she was more accustomed to peaceful work than warfare. Well now, I'd be happy to move along, Jake said, still maintaining his casual tone. But I've got a problem. You see, I used to work for the Territorial Marshal's office a few years back, and I happen to know that those horses with the Triple Crown brand shouldn't be in the hands of vigilantes. That's government property, which means either you boys have some official authority you haven't mentioned, or you've got some explaining to do. The tension in the clearing ratcheted up several notches. Several of the men shifted nervously, and Jake saw hands moving toward weapons, but the silver-haired man held up a hand to stop them. You're making a serious mistake, Morrison, the man said coldly. These are dangerous times, and sometimes good men have to take the law into their own hands to protect innocent lives. These Apache women are part of a raiding party that has been terrorizing the borderland. They killed 3 ranchers just last week. Jake nodded slowly, but his eyes remained skeptical. If that's the case, then I'm sure you won't mind if I ride into Tucson and verify that with Marshal Bradley. He's a friend of mine, and I'm sure he'd want to know about such serious crimes in his territory. The effect of Jake's words was immediate and telling. Several of the men exchanged worried glances, and the silver-haired man's jaw tightened with barely controlled anger. Jake knew he had struck a nerve, and his suspicions about the true nature of this hanging grew stronger. There's no time for that, another man spoke up. Justice delayed is justice denied. These savages need to pay for their crimes right now. Jake shifted slightly in his saddle, a movement that put his gun hand in a better position. Funny thing about justice, he said conversationally. I've found that folks who are really interested in it don't usually mind taking the time to do things proper-like. Makes a man wonder what the big hurry is. The oldest of the Apache women suddenly spoke, her voice carrying clearly across the tense silence. This man speaks wisdom, she said, looking directly at Jake. We are not raiders. We are peaceful people from the mission at San Xavier. These men took us while we gathered medicine plants in the desert. The silver-haired man whirled on her furiously. Shut your lying mouth, woman. But the damage was done. Jake now knew he was looking at something far more sinister than frontier justice. San Xavier was a peaceful Apache settlement that had been working cooperatively with the territorial government for years. If these women were from there, they were definitely not raiders. San Xavier, you say? Jake addressed the Apache woman directly. That's Father Miguel's mission, isn't it? I've heard he does fine work with your people. Yes, the woman replied, ignoring the murderous looks from her captors. Father Miguel teaches us the white man's ways of peace. We learn to read and write, to farm and raise animals. We do not make war. Jake felt a cold anger building in his chest. Whatever was happening here, it had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with something much darker. He had seen enough corruption in his years as a lawman to recognize the signs. These men weren't interested in punishing criminals. They were about to commit murder, and they were in a hurry to get it done before anyone could ask uncomfortable questions. Gentlemen, Jake said, his voice taking on a harder edge, I'm afraid I can't let this proceed until I've had a chance to verify these ladies' stories. I'm going to have to insist that you release them into my custody until we can sort this whole thing out properly. The silver-haired man's face flushed red with rage. You have no authority here, Morrison. You're just one man against 12. Don't be a fool. Jake's hand moved to rest on his gun butt, and his voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. Maybe so, but I'm one man with a conscience and a fast draw. The question is, how many of you boys are willing to die for whatever dirty business you're really up to here? The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, with 12 armed men facing off against one determined rider. The Apache women watched with growing hope, while the desert wind continued to blow hot and merciless across the scene. Jake knew he was vastly outnumbered, but he also knew that men engaged in criminal activity often lacked the resolve of someone fighting for what was right. His years of experience had taught him to read men's faces and body language. Several of the ranch hands looked uncomfortable and uncertain, as if they were beginning to have second thoughts about their involvement. But the three well-dressed men remained cold and determined, and Jake sensed they had too much at stake to back down easily. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, with life and death hanging in the scorching desert air between them. The silver-haired man slowly reached into his jacket, and Jake tensed, ready to draw his weapon. But instead of a gun, the man pulled out a leather wallet and opened it to reveal a gleaming badge. "Deputy Federal Marshal Thomas Blackwood," the man announced coldly. "These Apache women are wanted for murder and theft. I have full federal authority to carry out their execution." Jake studied the badge carefully, noting its authentic appearance, but his suspicions remained strong. Federal marshals didn't typically travel with posses of 12 men, and they certainly didn't conduct hasty executions without proper trials. "That's an impressive badge, Marshal Blackwood," Jake replied evenly. "Mind if I see the arrest warrants for these women? Federal law requires proper documentation for capital offenses." Blackwood's eyes flashed with irritation. "The paperwork is being processed in Santa Fe. In times of emergency, federal marshals have the authority to act swiftly to protect public safety." Jake had spent enough time around real federal marshals to know that Blackwood's explanation didn't ring true. "Funny thing about emergency powers," he said, dismounting from his horse with deliberate slowness. "I worked with Marshal Jim Patterson out of El Paso for 2 years, and he always said that federal authority was like a fine watch. It only worked properly when all the pieces were in their right places." One of the Apache women, a middle-aged woman with intelligent eyes and graying hair, spoke up in perfect English. "This man lies. I am Maria Delgado, daughter of Chief Delgado and teacher at the San Xavier Mission. Father Miguel sent us to gather sacred plants for the healing ceremonies. We have harmed no one." Blackwood struck her across the face with the back of his hand. "Silence, you lying savage!" The casual brutality of the act confirmed Jake's worst fears about the situation. Real lawmen, even hard ones, didn't typically strike bound prisoners without provocation. His hand moved closer to his gun. "Easy there, Marshal," Jake said, his voice carrying a warning. "That seems like mighty rough treatment for a prisoner who's just answering questions." "These animals don't deserve gentle treatment," one of the other well-dressed men spoke up. "They're responsible for attacks that have cost innocent lives and thousands of dollars in stolen property." Jake turned his attention to this new speaker, noting the man's soft hands and expensive clothing. "And you are?" "Harrison Webb, Territorial Representative for Land Development. I've seen firsthand the destruction these raiders have caused to legitimate business interests in the region." The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place in Jake's mind. Land development, territorial politics, federal authority being claimed without proper documentation. It all pointed toward the kind of corruption he had encountered before in his law enforcement days. "Mr. Webb," Jake said thoughtfully, "what exactly kind of land development are we talking about? This area is pretty remote for most business ventures." Webb's face tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mining operations primarily, silver and copper deposits that could bring prosperity to the entire territory." Jake nodded slowly, but his eyes were now scanning the area around the makeshift gallows more carefully. For the first time, he noticed that the wooden structure looked recently built, not something that had been erected hastily to deal with captured criminals. The lumber was new and the construction was too solid and professional for a temporary execution site. "That's interesting," Jake said. "I've been prospecting in these parts myself. Haven't seen any mining claims filed with the territorial office. Course, I could be wrong about that." The third well-dressed man, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. "The claims are being processed through proper channels. The federal government is very interested in developing the mineral resources of this region." "And you are?" Jake asked. "Colonel James Morrison, Territorial Liaison for Federal Land Management." Jake's eyebrows rose slightly at the man's surname, but he didn't comment on it. Instead, he focused on a detail that had been bothering him since he arrived. "Colonel Morrison, I'm curious about something. If these women are dangerous raiders who have been terrorizing the area, how exactly did 12 well-armed men manage to capture 7 of them without a fight? I don't see any signs of a battle, no blood, no torn clothing. These ladies look like they were picked up while they were having a church picnic." The question struck home. Several of the ranch hands shifted uncomfortably, and Jake noticed that some of them were avoiding eye contact. These were men who were used to violence, and their discomfort suggested they knew something was wrong with the situation. Maria Delgado spoke again, her voice calm but determined. "We were gathering plants near the water spring 2 miles from here when these men surrounded us. They told us we were under arrest, but they would not say why. They brought us here and built this structure while we watched. We have committed no crimes." Blackwood raised his hand to strike her again, but Jake's voice cut through the hot air like a whip crack. "I wouldn't do that again if I were you, Marshal." The 2 men locked eyes across the desert clearing, and something dangerous passed between them. Blackwood slowly lowered his hand, but the hatred in his gaze was unmistakable. Jake decided to press his advantage. "You know, I'm remembering something that's been bothering me. Last month I was in Tucson, and I heard tell of some problems with federal representatives who weren't quite what they claimed to be. Seems there was some kind of land swindle involving fake federal authority and forged documents." The reaction was immediate and telling. Webb and Colonel Morrison exchanged quick glances, while several of the ranch hands began to look openly worried. Jake knew he had struck close to the truth. "Are you accusing federal officers of fraud?" Blackwood demanded, his voice rising with anger. "I'm not accusing anyone of anything," Jake replied calmly. "I'm just trying to understand why federal marshals would be conducting executions in secret, in the middle of nowhere, without proper trials or documentation. Seems like the kind of thing that might interest a territorial judge." One of the younger ranch hands suddenly spoke up, his voice cracking with nervousness. "Mr. Blackwood, maybe we should think about this. If this fellow's right about the federal requirements—" "Shut up, Peters," Blackwood snapped. "You're being paid to follow orders, not to think." The exchange revealed more than Blackwood probably intended. Jake now knew that at least some of the men were hired hands rather than legitimate law enforcement, and that money was changing hands for their participation. Jake decided to take a calculated risk. "Peters, is it? Son? I've been in situations like this before, and I can tell you that things generally go better for the hired help when they're not involved in murder, especially when the people doing the hiring might not be exactly who they claim to be." Peters looked uncertainly between Jake and Blackwood, clearly torn between his orders and his growing doubts about the situation. "Don't listen to him, Peters," Webb interrupted sharply. "This man is obviously in league with the Apache raiders. He's trying to trick you into letting dangerous criminals escape." But Jake had seen enough fear and uncertainty in the men's faces to know that he might be able to create enough doubt to prevent the executions. He pressed on. "Think about it, boys. If everything was legitimate here, why would your bosses be so worried about one unarmed man asking questions? Real federal marshals welcome witnesses to their official duties. They don't try to hide their work or hurry through executions before anyone can verify their authority." The oldest of the ranch hands, a grizzled man with gray whiskers, suddenly stepped forward. "Blackwood, I hired on to chase down horse thieves and cattle rustlers. Nobody said anything about hanging women without a trial." "Your job is to do what you're told, Henderson," Blackwood replied coldly. "These Apache women are murderers and thieves. They deserve to hang." But Henderson shook his head. "I've been working cattle and chasing rustlers for 20 years, and I never seen raiders who looked like these ladies. They got soft hands and clean clothes. They don't look like they ever held a weapon in their lives." Jake sensed the mood shifting in his favor and decided to reveal what he suspected was the real truth behind the situation. "Gentlemen, I think what we have here is a land grab disguised as law enforcement. These women aren't raiders. They're witnesses to something that certain powerful men don't want exposed. The question is, what did they see that was worth killing them to hide?" Maria Delgado's eyes widened with sudden understanding. "The silver mine," she said quietly. "They think we saw the silver mine." The effect of her words was electric. Blackwood's face went pale while Webb and Colonel Morrison looked at each other in obvious panic. Jake knew he had stumbled onto something much bigger than he had imagined. "What silver mine?" he asked, keeping his voice carefully neutral. 3 days ago, while gathering plants, we saw men bringing wagon loads of silver ore from a hidden mine in the eastern canyon. They wore the same clothes as these men, and they had the same horses with the Triple Crown brand. We thought it was strange because the Apache lands are protected by treaty, and no mining is supposed to happen there without tribal consent. Jake felt all the pieces clicking into place. This wasn't just about land development. It was about illegal mining on protected Apache territory, with federal officials taking bribes to look the other way. The 7 women had witnessed evidence of the operation, and now they had to be eliminated before they could report what they had seen. The stakes had just gotten much higher, and Jake realized he was facing men who had far more to lose than he had initially understood. The revelation about the illegal silver mine changed everything in the desert clearing. Jake could see the desperation in the eyes of Blackwood, Webb, and Colonel Morrison as they realized their secret was exposed. These weren't just corrupt officials trying to steal Apache land. They were part of a major criminal conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. "Now I understand the hurry," Jake said, his voice hard with contempt. "You can't afford to let these women live long enough to tell anyone about your illegal mining operation. How much silver have you stolen from Apache land? Must be worth a fortune to risk murdering innocent women." Blackwood's mask of federal authority finally slipped completely. His hand moved toward his gun as his face twisted with rage. "You've seen too much, Morrison. You should have minded your own business." Jake had been expecting this moment. His draw was smooth and practiced, the Colt appearing in his hand before Blackwood could clear leather. The corrupt marshal froze with his weapon half drawn, staring down the barrel of Jake's gun. "I wouldn't," Jake said quietly. "Drop it nice and easy." Blackwood's gun hit the desert sand with a dull thud. Around the clearing, the other men stood frozen, unsure whether to draw their own weapons or surrender. "Here's how this is going to work," Jake announced, his gun steady in his hand. "Henderson, Peters, and any other working men who got fooled into this mess, you can walk away right now. Take your horses and ride out. I've got no quarrel with men who were lied to." Henderson immediately stepped back from the group, his relief obvious. Peters and 3 other ranch hands quickly followed suit, moving toward their horses without looking back. "The rest of you," Jake continued, "are going to step away from those women and explain exactly what's been going on here." Webb made a sudden move toward his coat, but Jake swung his gun toward him. "I wouldn't recommend that, Mr. Webb. You've already committed enough crimes for one day." Colonel Morrison, who had remained silent through most of the confrontation, finally spoke up. "You're making a terrible mistake, Morrison. This operation has approval at the highest levels of government. You're interfering with national security interests." Jake laughed harshly. National security? Is that what you call stealing silver from Indian land and murdering witnesses? I've seen a lot of corruption in my time, but you boys have set a new standard. Maria Delgado spoke up from beneath her noose, her voice filled with quiet dignity. The mine is in the sacred canyon of our ancestors. The Treaty of 1868 guarantees that land to our people forever. What these men are doing violates both white man's law and Apache law. How much have you stolen? Jake demanded, keeping his gun trained on the three conspirators. Webb's composure finally cracked. You don't understand the economics involved. That silver deposit is worth millions of dollars. It could fund territorial development for decades. A few Apache savages can't be allowed to stand in the way of progress. So, you decided to kill them rather than follow the law and negotiate with the tribal council, Jake said with disgust. How many people are involved in this conspiracy? Blackwood remained silent, but Colonel Morrison seemed eager to justify their actions. Half the territorial government knows about the operation. The Federal Mining Authority has given its blessing. This is bigger than you can imagine, Morrison. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. If Morrison was telling the truth, the corruption reached far beyond these three men. The illegal mining operation might involve dozens of officials, making it extremely dangerous for anyone who tried to expose it. What about the attacks you blamed on these women? Jake pressed. Were those real, or did you stage them to justify your actions? Webb looked down at the ground, unable to meet Jake's eyes. We arranged for some incidents, made it look like Apache raids, had to give the ranchers and townspeople a reason to support military action against the tribes. The full scope of their scheme was becoming clear to Jake. They had orchestrated fake raids to turn public opinion against the Apache, providing cover for military action that would drive the tribes off their land and open the way for illegal mining operations. One of the Apache women, the youngest one who had first spoken up, looked at Jake with desperate hope. Will you help us get word to the territorial marshal? Father Miguel must be told what has happened to us. Jake nodded, but he knew the situation was far more complicated than the young woman realized. If the conspiracy really did involve multiple levels of government, going to the territorial marshal might simply put them all in greater danger. First things first, he said. Let's get those nooses off your necks. He gestured with his gun toward Blackwood. Cut them loose. All of them. Blackwood hesitated, and Jake's voice took on a dangerous edge. Do it now, or I'll shoot you where you stand. Blackwood reluctantly moved toward the gallows and began cutting the ropes that bound the women. As each noose was removed, Jake felt some of the tension leave his shoulders, but he knew they were still in grave danger. As the last of the Apache women was freed, Jake heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. His heart sank as he realized that more men were arriving, probably reinforcements for Blackwood's group. Expecting company? Jake asked grimly. Webb smiled for the first time since Jake's arrival. The rest of our security team. You're outnumbered 20-1 now, Morrison. Jake quickly assessed his options. He was trapped in an open clearing with 7 unarmed women to protect and 20 or more armed men approaching. Fighting his way out seemed impossible, but surrender would mean death for all of them. Then Maria Delgado stepped up beside him, her dark eyes filled with determination. There is another way, she said quietly. The sacred canyon has hidden paths known only to our people. If we can reach the canyon entrance, we can escape through passages that no white man knows. Jake looked toward the sound of the approaching horses, then back at the Apache women. It was a desperate gamble, but it might be their only chance. How far to the canyon entrance? He asked. 1/2 mile through the rocks to the east, but the path is treacherous, and these men know the desert well. Jake made his decision quickly. Can you lead us there? Maria nodded firmly. Yes, but we must go now before the others arrive. Jake backed toward the eastern edge of the clearing, his gun still trained on Blackwood and his companions. Ladies, we're leaving. Stay close and do exactly what Maria tells you. The group of freed women quickly gathered around Maria, who began leading them toward a gap in the rock formations that Jake hadn't noticed before. He continued to cover their retreat, walking backward and keeping his weapon ready. "You can't escape!" Blackwood shouted after them. "We'll hunt you down like the animals you are!" Jake paused just long enough to deliver a final warning. "If I were you, Blackwood, I'd be more worried about explaining to your bosses how 7 unarmed women and 1 drifter managed to expose your entire operation." As they reached the cover of the rocks, Jake could hear the sound of multiple horses entering the clearing behind them. Shouts and angry voices echoed off the canyon walls as Blackwood explained the situation to his reinforcements. The chase was on, and Jake knew they would need every advantage they could get to survive what was coming. Maria led them through a narrow passage between towering rock walls, moving with sure-footed confidence over terrain that would have challenged most white men. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew louder as their enemies organized and began following their trail. Jake realized this would be a running battle across some of the most dangerous country in the Arizona Territory, with the lives of 7 innocent women hanging in the balance. As they climbed higher into the sacred canyon, Maria pointed ahead to a series of rock formations that looked like natural fortifications. "The hidden mine entrance is beyond those rocks," she said. "If we can reach it, there are tunnels that lead all the way to the San Xavier mission." Jake nodded, understanding that their survival now depended on reaching those tunnels before their pursuers could corner them in the open desert. The real battle for justice in the borderlands was just beginning, and he knew that exposing the truth about the illegal mining operation would require more than just escaping with their lives. The sun was beginning to set over the Arizona Badlands, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that matched the violence and hope of the day's events. Whatever happened next, Jake Morrison had chosen his side in a fight that would determine whether corruption or justice would prevail in the wild frontier territories.